All right, I guess we're going. All right. This is, we're starting a whole new section tonight, and therefore we have to look at where we've gone, or what we've done before, and then dig into the new material. The first, we're looking at aspects, and this is our third year of doing it. And we began first with looking at the aspects statically, as if they were stopped actions, standing still, and we did that with a Platonistic type of spiritual mathematics. Then we looked at aspects as major turning points inside of ongoing cycles, when things change state and the cycle does different work. Then we looked at the mandala. Spent a lot of time using examples, looking at the mandala and seeing the basic creative ideas of the astrological mandala as being a symbol for the universe, which we interpret from the human point of view, and try to universalize and understand all interactions between humans. And then the section we've just finished has been a section on estimation, where we try to estimate the relative strength of each aspect with each other aspect, and then we try to do a bunch of analysis to show how different aspects are interpreted depending on the strengths of the planet and the planets involved and the strengths of the aspects. Now what we're going to begin now is going to be a little bit more subtle. We're going to be looking at something that's different. It's a totally different, a different kind of astrology. It is called declinational astrology. And the aspects that are involved in declinational astrology are the parallel aspects. Now the aspects that we've looked at so far are called longitudinal aspects because they're found on the astronomical longitude, that is, on the signs of the zodiac. And the way we look at things, the signs of the zodiac, when we see a square between Saturn and Jupiter, we see that on the whole big thing, not exactly how it looks from Earth. That would be a totally different kind of astrology. There is something like that. We'll talk about it in a little bit. Longitudinal astrology is, if we have the sun in a band around the sun, all of the planets go in this one band, which is from the Earth it looks like 13 degrees. This band around the center of the sun is shaped like a flying saucer, which is probably the most efficient vehicle for traveling through three-dimensional space, the shape for it. Because that's basically what most galaxies are like too. They're a ball in the center, and then they often have arms out like that, but they're basically a disk with surrounding a ball. And on this third planet out, the sun is inclined on its axis, and it goes around. The Earth is inclined on its axis, and it goes around the sun. If we look from the top down, if we were looking like this from above the solar system, you would have the sun, and then you'd have Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, and so on. And they all go around the sun, and they all rotate on their axis the same direction that they go around the sun, with the exception of Uranus, which rotates the opposite direction. So we're doing a top-down look, and the stars at the end of the ecliptic, the constellations, if you're looking from the top down, it would be like, and so this is, everything is based on this ecliptic. That's longitudinal astrology. I should have brought in the armillary sphere. It would have been showed it much more clearly. I'm not prepared to do that now, I suppose. But this is longitudinal astrology because everything is measured on the ecliptic as though you're looking at it from the top down. There's a geocentric, what?
Should I go get it?
No, I would get it if I needed, but we can do without it. There is a bias from the Earth. It's not heliocentric astrology. It is as seen from Earth, but it is not as seen from the local location. Now there is another astrology that is based completely on the way things look from the Earth. That is, it's made up of azimuths. It's an azimuthal astrology. Very few people do much with it because it doesn't have a lot of history and there are not a lot of figures from it. So you know what I'm trying to say with that, what I'm saying, azimuthal astrology? It's like if we went outside and we looked at a star, or if we looked at a planet, we'd measure from the Earth the angle that it is off of the horizon, and that is called an azimuth. And there's another factor to giving a location, the coordinates. It's azimuth and I forget it. All right. And that would, your squares would then be visual squares. Whether they were squares on the zodiac or not, they would depend on visual observation. That makes a lot of sense, except that it doesn't take into account that the solar system is a womb for evolving beings, and the most significant factors in that are the signs of the zodiac that surround the disk of the sun, and it's meaningful because of that higher purpose of it. All right. What we're going to look at now is declinational astrology. Oh, here I got it in the notes. Azimuth and altitude. That is the distance from the true south line versus the distance up from the horizon. All right. Now, what we're going to look at is everything is not measured according to the declinational astrology that we're looking at now is not measured according to the signs of the zodiac. It is completely local to the Earth. That is, it relates to the Earth as a body spinning in the heavens. It's sometimes called, beside declinational astrology, it's sometimes called the astrology of parallels. The idea is that if you have the Earth, don't worry even about the inclination of the axis, just have a regular Earth upright, and then you have the celestial equator, the North Pole of the celestial equator. And if a planet is, say, 15 degrees above the celestial equator, any other planet that is 15 degrees above or 15 degrees below is said to be parallel to it. Now this is all of astrology. The context that we use for understanding what astrology points to. Everything else is based on the angles that are formed in the ecliptic. This is based on the angles of planets relative to the Earth itself, relative to the equatorial band of the Earth itself. It's very different. There have been a lot of speculations. It's easy to understand why, if both planets that are parallel to each other are north, it's easy to understand why there would be a relationship there, because one planet cuts across, and then a few hours later another planet cuts across the same place, and so there's a reinforced etching, an angular incidence of energies that that would etch its way in. Mark and I used to look at that. We never got too far, looking at planets that latitude stars, because in history certain stars pass over certain cities at certain times in the precessional cycle. And people used to study that, and they tried to tell when the latitude star was right overhead, and it had a very strong influence on those places. It's one of those things I wanted to look into, but have never had a chance to do it. It's not so easy to figure out why one planet that is north and another planet that is south, especially if it's south right over here, why they should have a geometric relationship. And the only thing that I can understand is that it must have something to do with the magnetic field. That there is something like a reflection in the magnetic field, so that when something north of the equator is activated, something at the same degree south of the equator, things like that happen with the sunspot cycles. There are polarities like that that reverse themselves, that sunspots that appear in one hemisphere in one cycle, in the next hemisphere they will be in the other hemisphere of the sun. Now, this is an astrology, declinational astrology, that isn't much used today. And that's sort of something that is puzzling, because parallel aspects, if they are close orb parallel aspects, are at least as strong as longitudinal aspects. However, the effects of parallels are usually not looked at as something psychospiritual, something that indicates a change or a quality in your consciousness. Instead, the parallel has a lot to do with physical conditions. That is, illnesses and things like that. My own view on it, which is not a highly educated view, is that when a personality trait has become so strong that it gets built right into the body and one needs to experience it somatically, that is brought in by a parallel. Now, if two planets happen to be parallel to each other and at the same time form a longitudinal aspect, then there is a relationship between the attitude of the longitudinal aspect and the fact that it is brought in to be physical. Usually those are the strongest parallel aspects when there are both parallels and when there are longitudinal aspects at the same time. If a planet is in a parallel and it has a longitudinal aspect with some other planet that is not in a parallel, there's often a connection with that because they both bear on that same thing. Now, declinational astrology is more ancient than longitudinal astrology, though it's hard to say. At least historically it is more ancient. Porphyry, the Neoplatonist, said that there was a zodiac before there were stars, meaning to say that there was the basic archetypal ideas, Platonic ideas that become the ideas of the zodiac, were there and had that geometric formation with each other before the heavens were divided up or became the womb of a solar system. Now, some of the earliest astrologies in both Babylon and in China were declinational, because without, it takes quite a bit of sophistication to have an observatory and then to translate what's happening in a local observatory to get the perspective of the planets around the sun. That takes a pretty sophisticated astronomy. Whereas the declinational astrology is something you don't need any sophistication for at all. And that is, I know that for a fact, because the visual effect of declinational astrology, I have been studying for 65 years. I'll try to, yeah. It's something that goes back to my childhood when I was in grade school. I'll draw you a map of what our farm was like. It's all changed now. This was called Highway E, County Highway E in Sheboygan County. And here, the road went around because there was a dying lake here. And this dying lake used to have, was a hot spot for the Indians. And somewhere off here was another road, and then the road went up this way and went around this way. And this was where the famous rooster church was, that had a rooster on the pinnacle of the steeple. Instead of a cross, they had a rooster. Our farm was right here. I shouldn't put that there because that makes it seem like there's a road. There was another road here, which was over here was an old woods that had a lot of squirrels in it. This was a woods over here that had been logged over for the Second World War. And it was when I was about 10 years old, I guess, the raspberries were in there after the war. We used to go, this was 40 acres of woods, and we'd go running through the woods all summer long and pick raspberries and things like that. Our farmhouse was here, and there was a shed here, and here was a great big garden that my mother kept, and the barn was here, and the chicken coop was here, and over here was the woodshed, and out here about was the outhouse. The farmhouse was like that. This is north, and here from the barn ran a lane out, and then there was a cross lane here. And this was a stone fence, and then there was a major field here and a major field here. And here was a giant elm tree. And it was almost like the Yggdrasil tree, because there was a hawk that would hang out in that elm tree. And over here were elderberries, and we'd pick elderberries and have elderberry pies. But what I used to do, this old woods kept, when I'd look out the kitchen window and look at the sun would set at different places relative to the elm tree at different times of the year. And so here I am, a 10-year-old kid with no sophistication at all, and yet I understand there's something going on, and I have no idea intellectually what it means, but I observed it, and I knew it had something to do with summer and winter because I could see that. That when the sun set down this way further, it was cold. And when it was set up this way further, it was hot. And so this was the basis of declinational astrology. This is something that's not new. Now the ancient Babylonians and the Chinese used to do the same thing, only they would look more carefully at the horizon. They would look at the horizon where the sun rose and where the sun set. And they watched or they noted where each and every other planet rose and set. And the way it worked out for the Chinese was that if the sun set here and the moon set here, suppose the moon was riding high and the moon set here, then if Mars set here, it was closer to the sun than it was to the moon, and that would mean that it was a solar Mars. Only with the Chinese, it was set up with the whole yin-yang system. And so that a planet was yin if it was closer to the moon. And it was the moon, the yin is the female, right? Yeah. And if it was, so this would be a yang Mars. And so they had the whole astrology based on that. Of course, when the sun and the moon came together, then there would be an eclipse, and depending whether it was an eclipse of the sun or an eclipse of the moon, if it was an eclipse of the sun, that would be really very, very yin, because the sun would even be blotted out of the sky and everything would be dark. If it was an eclipse of the moon, obviously it would be a very yang time. So they had a whole system of astrology that was based on that. By the way, this was interesting. We had a woods that went in back in this area here. It was our own woods. And I had a little mystical experience there when I was a child. It was really strange. I was in a different dimension with colors and everything else. But along here were Indian mounds. And when I was a child, maybe about 6 years old, something like that, my father would be plowing. It was behind horses, with a hand plow like that, and he would turn up arrowheads. We had a whole bunch of arrowheads like that. He found them all the time. I have some really good remembrances from those times. All right. So what we're talking about here is Earth and things etched onto the surface of the Earth, speaking metaphorically. The whole, I'm close to exhaustion. I worked so much today that I almost fell over with tiredness. The tree that was here was an elm tree. But in the earth, it's a tree, whether it's the Bodh tree, whatever you want to call it, is the tree of the earth. It's the tree on which Christ is crucified. It is the tree with which, when Buddha sat with his back to the tree, is when he had his enlightenment. And it is the tree that had golden apples in it. And the golden apples were the life-giving forces that came from the stars. And the life-giving forces that came from the stars were under Aphrodite in the Greek myth. And in this tree, there were bears that would sleep in the tree. You see where we're going. This is, if you had etheric vision, you don't even need etheric vision when there are northern lights, the magnetic field of the earth would be like a trunk of a great tree coming out of the earth and coming out and spreading out like that. And if you were looking through that magnetic field of the earth or that etheric field of the earth, you would see the constellations. And the constellations were the Great Bear and the Small Bear. And at the base of the tree is a dragon. In the Aphrodite myth, it was Koepsel, the dragon that guarded the golden apples and guarded the mysteries that are associated with the North Pole also. So what we're talking about here is a world myth. It's a description of the world in a mythical way so that it can be, that we can relate our prosaic circumstances that we see in nature, that we can relate it to something higher and more far-reaching. The tree was often called an elm tree because in the Norse mythology there were two trees, the elm and the ash, that were sacred. To the Greeks, it certainly would have had to have been an ash tree because all of the big events among the Greeks happened under ash trees. It was under the ash nymphs that raised Zeus when he was born. The Embla was the name of the sacred elm tree to the ancient people. And elm or embl is short for Amblodi, which is another name for Saturn. And so this is a pretty fantastical tree because the world tree has three roots. One of the roots is in the Midgard, that is in the earth itself. Another root is in the world of ice, the world of the frost giants, the Niflheim. And another one of the roots is in Muspelheim, which is the area of the fire and steam and things like that. And in this tree, on the branches of the tree, goats and deer were eating, and at the top of the tree was an eagle, and on top of the eagle's shoulder was a hawk. So can you top this? And Wotan had his throne way up in the tree so he could see what was happening in the world, because he was the chief deity of the world. And he had these two ravens that went forethought and afterthought that went out and told him everything that was going on in different parts of the world. Lodj is another name for Loki, or is another name for Amlodhi, which is another name for Hamlet. So when we're talking about the world tree and we're talking about who owns the world tree, we're talking about Hamlet. And Hamlet is that Saturnine figure, very dark and heavy. All the destiny takes place around him. There's a lovely thing that was done by two historians of science called Hamlet's Mill, where they traced this myth through many different societies. And it was Herta van Dachshund and Giorgio Santillana that wrote the book Hamlet's Mill. If you can get a copy of it, read it. It's really exciting to read. And it ties together all ancient mythology through the precession of the equinox. And the Yggdrasil tree is is one of the things that ties it all together. Now, there are real differences. There is what is called the Nordic doom. People who live in the north get dark and heavy, and they become Saturnian in nature. Whereas people who are born at the equator, because they have to learn to be laid back, and so they have let it happen. And they have actually even done studies like this, where they have taken people and they put them in rooms. They give them a pad of paper and tell them, you're going to have to wait for a while for this experiment. Here's a pad, you can write or do whatever you want to do. And then they change the conditions inside the room. And the more the conditions become like the North Pole, that is the cold and dry, the doodles become sharp and rigid and harsh. Whereas when you make it like equatorial areas where it's hot and steamy, the doodles become more curved. So there's a whole change in consciousness. There's even a relationship between the size of animals. When things are more toward the equator, in general, you usually have larger animals. The further you get from the equator, the likelihood of a large animal diminishes, with the one exception being the polar bear that I know of. Now, if we take the Earth, what?
And caribou.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, no.
While you're erasing that, you were pretty sure where the woodshed was located. Were you quite familiar with that? Or
You know, actually, I think I got struck twice in my childhood. And only one instance that I can remember, and it was with my mother, not with my father. And I was making such a fuss, and I just flustered her altogether, and she just didn't know what to do. And she just went like that. And that was the only time I really got struck. If this is the Earth, we have the equator, and because of the inclination, we have the frigid zones, and within the tropics, we have the torrid zone. Temperate. Now, we just said that the frigid zones are ruled by Saturn. The torrid zones, the hot, sticky, are ruled by the moon. And in between, where most of the activity has happened in the world, is the temperate zones are ruled by the sun. Now, if you want to, you can actually break down everything from the equator to the North Pole, and you can put the ladder of the stars on. Oops. Shh. And you have the ladder of the stars. You have the whole spectrum of influences that way. Now, in fact, you can look at the prominence of different kinds of colors in fruits and how things grow. In general, forms start from the equatorial zones and work their way north. ideas or thoughts start from the polar regions and work their way south. I don't want to go into it because I'm very exhausted and very tired, and I would make a muddle of it. If you have the Earth spinning on its axis, and its axis is inclined to the sun at different places in its orbit, the sun will appear to be in different. So if you take this as a graph and you have the Earth spinning and you record the position of the sun this would be the vernal equinox. This would be the autumnal equinox. This would be a summer solstice over here. And it goes all the way around the Earth that way. You can make a drawing. That's what this is. This is a drawing of the zodiac by declination, as though the Earth were spinning and going around its orb, or in its orbit around the sun, and you were graphically putting at the sun's position. This is what you would see. This is the famous python of Apollo Pytheas, because the oracle at Delphi used to belong to the Earth. All of the oracles were at first given to Mother Earth. If you remember in Wagner's operas, Erda had domain of all of the prophecy. Eventually, the sun took over that activity, which means to say, instead of it being something Chthonian, something that comes from our earthly instinctual nature, the oracle became something that was more a matter of waking self-consciousness. And that waking self-consciousness eventually, when it became objectified, was the end of all oracles. But at any rate, in the myth, when Apollo came to the oracle of the Earth, it was guarded by the python. And for 1 year, he wrestled with the python. And at the end of that year, he overcame the python, and he then became the oracle. And he was then called Apollo Pytheas. And the oracle women that used to be in the chair that was suspended by a tripod over the cleft in the earth, and when the gases would come out, they would go into a trance, and they would give all sorts of prophecies, that they were then called Pythian, Apollo's Pythian oracles. The Apollo himself was he who sees all, knows all. Meaning to say that when you struggle with all of the trials indicated by all of the signs of the zodiac in the course of the year, you become like the sun. You become like the ultimate hero. You become the initiate. And if you can work through all of the trials that are associated with each of the signs of the zodiac, then you are a whole person. You don't have a weakness. You don't have a strong point. You don't have a preference of one thing over another. You are equally at ease with all of the forces that are behind everything in nature, and that's what an initiate is a perfectly balanced human being who is spiritually self-aware and is not overcome by the external influences. It's a free being that can overcome anything that is animate in animal-like in nature. And so that's what took place. And so, all right, we are finally at where we want to get at, and this is going to take just a little less than an hour. solar cycle, the solar declinational cycle, not the solar longitudinal cycle, the solar declinational cycle is the most dominant of all cycles in human experience. The mythologies that we have about the Aries being a rising energy when the sun is in Aries, that is true. But the longitudinal character of Aries is not as important in the changing of nature as the declination is, because it is the angle of incidence of the sun that causes the sap to rise, that causes things to get moving. So what we're looking at is we're looking at a dominant nature force, and we're not looking at what's happening in the heavens, in the heavens that are indicated by the signs of the zodiac, where the gods are interacting with each other in mythological stories. What we're looking at is directly how things impinge on the earth, and we're seeing the battle of the bulge of the earth, the waste that it has. All the planets are either north or south of the belt, and the influences that they have in changing things in nature. So this is, we're saying then that natural forces are very strongly moved by the angle of incidence of the sun, and to some extent by the other planets, because the parallels certainly do work. The parallels to the sun are usually stronger than other parallels. That's obvious from nature also. So, everything from enzyme activity to growth to things withdrawing into the earth. Like this year, I'm going to try to apply this. I'm going to try to prune my grapes during the week between Christmas and New Year's, because the forces, new forces have not come out, but they're withdrawn into the earth as far as they're going to be withdrawn. The parallels are all declinational aspects. And since we're talking about outer effects of nature being changed by the declination of the sun and other planets, what we're talking about with the parallel is the outer effects of nature and the physical body. There is a relationship between them, but what we're going to talk about for the next 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 classes now, is the parallels. All right. This is. What?
Did you hand anything out last week?
Yes.
Okay.
I can get you whatever. Oh, there's one up there.
Yeah, there's one right here. Oh, cool, thanks.
All right. Let's look at these 4 possibilities. On the back side, everything is explained. Briefly, but it's explained. All right. A parallel aspect occurs when 2 planets are in the same declination. That is, the same distance from the celestial equator. It doesn't matter whether both are north or both are south, or one is north and one is south. The declination is the only factor. The orbs are very, very small. 1 degree at most, I started out using 1.5 degrees, but I found out that it wasn't as effective and it wasn't as accurate as using a 1 degree orb. All right, you have where the A is the basic planet, and B1 or B2 or B3 or B4 are the other possibilities. If we have A and B1, usually that's called a conjunction parallel, meaning to say that A and B1 are both in a conjunction. They're both on the same side of the equator. They're both on the same side of the equinox and both on the same side of the solstice. This is usually considered the strongest of all of the parallels. If we look at B2, A, B2, we have then both are in the same north or south hemisphere. In this case, in the diagram, they're both in the north hemisphere, and but they're on opposite sides of the closest solstice. So this is called a trans-solstitial parallel. This is the one that we said, it's obvious from the drawing that they're both going to cut across the earth and be etching etching the same spot on the earth at the same declination on the earth. If we have A, B3, they are in opposite hemispheres, and they are on opposite sides of the closest equinox, or equinoctial coal year is the proper way of saying it. And so what we have then is a trans-equinoctial parallel. And if we have A, B4, they are in opposite north-south hemispheres, and they are in opposite east-west hemispheres. And to go from A to B4, you have to go across both an equinoctial coal year and a solstitial coal year. But with B4, usually there is an opposition aspect. And when you have that reinforcing effect of the opposition, it makes it much, much stronger. It's what we've always said, that redundancy or repeated factors of a similar type make for a much stronger thing. And then finally at the bottom we have that table. The conjunction parallel is the strongest. The opposition parallel is the next strongest. And the trans-solstitial parallel, where they're both in the same hemisphere, north-south hemisphere, that is the third strongest, and usually the weakest by far is the trans-equinoctial parallel. There is only one thing that there are special cases. If you take A, B2, and you move both planets right up to the solstice, then you can have a conjunction between an A, B2. Or if you take both A and B3 and bring them close to the equinoctial point, then you can have a conjunction there. And those are rare cases. They are when events happen right at the solstice and at the equinox, and this is something that astrologers have noted for a long time, that the effects are very much stronger. So, the orbs are 1 degree or less. And I guess that is about all we have for tonight. I'm all pooped out, and yes.
I was just gonna say, I might be slow, but I didn't know or see the connection until tonight about the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. It just, I mean, it just defines where the sun is at its high spot. And that was it, you know.
Yes.
But I never associated that part of geography with astrology.
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. I think it just for the experience of it, it is important to go somewhere where you can see when something beyond the equator, when the sun is right straight overhead on the equator, or be at one of the tropics, right at the turning. I've been at close. I've been just a few minutes south of the Tropic of Capricorn at the time when the sun is there. It's quite something. You're looking like straight up in the air to see the sun. And they did a lot of things with that. The Egyptians especially built temples, and they oriented them so that in the Holy of Holies in the temple, only at the summer solstice, and at that time only did the sun shine in that room. Everything was lined up with big pillars and everything else, and only then would it shine in that room. It's quite remarkable. Even more remarkable is where they quarried the rock for the Great Pyramid, Cheops. It's at a place called Syene, and there is a well in Syene where they have dug down through rock, and there's a perfect circle at the bottom with water, and only at the summer solstice does the sun exactly fill that circle on the bottom of the well. Remarkable to do that kind of a thing. You could probably do it digging very, very slowly, but once a year you could only dig, to make sure that there were no shadows or something like that. Yes.
You said earlier, talking about the forms work their way north, and what works their way south?
What?
Thoughts.
What?
Thoughts.
Thoughts.
Yeah. Yes. Philosophical ideas tend to come from north-south, and right now, as the earth gets drier and drier, the chlorophyll that has an extra oxygen on, which holds water and doesn't need as much water, it's in succulents usually, those kinds of plants are now migrating further and further away from the tropics. Well, that's it. I'm sorry, I'm just not sharp tonight at all. Just done in. I'm not